Going back to your own experience now, what was your experience like in school? You talked a little bit about being labeled as slow, when clearly that wasn't the case. Were there anything, and you partly were shy because you felt you yourself was different. You yourself were different. What were the teachers like? Was there anybody who you connected with? What would have a good connection look like for you?
Well, I had a good connection with an English teacher
Yeah.
who picked up right away that I wasn't stupid.
Right.
Um, um, so I got really good marks in his class. Every time I wrote something for him, he'd be like, wow, so good out, so good. And even talked about it in class. This essay is really good, stuff like that. And um, and then I had a conversation years later with somebody who said, "Were you considered slow in school?" I'm like, "Yeah, I was." She said, "Yeah, it might have something to do with your First Nations background. Because First Nations children, when they're learning in school, they take a long time to answer because they're thinking about their answer,
Right.
right? But when you go to regular school, they want you to answer right away,
Right.
right? Like root learning, right? And I never understood the reasoning behind that. Like, I like to think about my answers. This is where I was considered slow because I thought carefully about what my answer would be, and they thought I was retarded. Anyway, so I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense to me, even though I didn't know I was. Well, I knew I was mixed First Nations, but we
Right.
did not talk about it.
At home.
No, it was
No.
a huge taboo subject to talk about in my home.
Why was that?
Because of racism,
Yeah.
because of the um, um, pressure to assimilate,
Right.
right, into Canadian culture. We had to leave all that behind and forget about it, basically. So yeah, so that's why.
So when you say you're mixed, there's First Nations family connections on which side of your family?
My mom's
Your
side.
mom's side. Okay.
Yeah, my grandfather, her father was
Okay.
Mi'kmaq, but he had blue eyes, so he probably had a Irish in there. Probably what saved him. He ran
Yeah.
away. He ran away when he was a kid. When he was 10 years old, he ran away. So we don't even know where he was born or why he ran away. But I'm learning in my Indigenous studies
Yeah.
about the Indian Act and how it tore families apart,
Right.
disenfranchised a lot of Native women to begin with. So I'm thinking his mother was disenfranchised, had no money,
Right.
probably told all the kids, well, you're not Indian anymore, or whatever, right? Maybe had no money, no food. Maybe that's why he ran away.
Right.
Yeah.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he was mixed himself. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, I've been thinking about her a lot, her background, and I believe she was descended from slaves who were brought to Cape Breton
Wow.
during the construction of the fortress, Fort Louisburg.
And they'd be slaves from where?
Not really sure. Probably
Okay.
Guyana.
Okay.
Yeah, they're still researching that.
Okay.
Where all the black people in Nova Scotia came from.
Right.
They're just acknowledging. They just acknowledged 2 years ago that they had slaves at Louisburg. A community of 250 slaves. And I believe my grandmother must be descended from them.
Okay.
There's a whole couple of streets in the town she grew up in, Glace Bay, where all the black people live. And I remember when I was a kid in grade 10, I was in grade 10, and a new kid started. And I said, oh, where are you coming from? Because it was a rural high school, right?
Right.
So everybody knew stands out. He said, oh, I am from Glace Bay. My parents just bought land outside the rural route. And yeah, so I'm at this school now. I said, oh, my grandmother grew up in Glace Bay. He says, oh, what street?
Uh-huh.
And I can't remember the name of the street now, but I said the name of the street and he just looked at me with shock. That's where all the black people live. I'm like, ooh. And a penny dropped.
Right.
Because I've been dealing with this for years.
Right.
Since we moved back to Cape Breton when I was 12. Before that, we were in the military.
Right.
So I didn't notice racism then until we moved back. And I was hanging out with my mother and my grandmother all the time. People were like, who are those two women you're hanging out with? I said, that's my mother and my grandmother. They're like, but those two women are black. I'm like, really? And they were like, were you adopted? I'm like, no. I'm black too. I could be black too. It was very hard to talk about. And I remember hearing fights. I had an uncle who was very racist, and he'd get in his cups and he'd say things about my mother and grandfather, my mother and my grandfather, and my grandmother. He'd say things about them at family gatherings, and my father would be like, "Get out of this house now! Get out now! Don't talk about my wife, my mother-in-law, my grandfather, my father-in-law like that."
Yeah.